Thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard Fajardo, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, and classes, so please check our website for a full list. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. Please silence or turn off your cell phones just so that it won't ring in the middle of the event. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar before asking your questions so we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation, but to also ensure that it is going to be recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them out front at the registers, so please buy them. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please line up by the pillar once again to do so. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. Now on to the main event. I am honored to introduce Jennifer Pahlka to all of you. Jennifer is the founder of Code for America, a nonprofit that works to bring the values of the digital era to the public sector, and the former Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. While at the Obama White House, she founded the United States Digital Service, a team of technologists devoted to improving government operations. Pahlka is the winner of a Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship and has been selected by Wired magazine as one of the people who have most shaped technology and society in the past 25 years. This evening, she will be talking about her new book, Recoding America, Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. In this incisive piece of nonfiction, Jennifer makes the case for overhauling the United States government to better serve the people of this country. Through the rewiring of the outdated bureaucracy and replacing it with a system that is more appropriate for the digital age, Jennifer presents a blueprint for how the recoding of American government can be done. Ezra Klein of the New York Times calls the book he wishes every policymaker would read. Tonight, Jennifer will be in conversation with Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is the CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing the promise and national ideals of the United States. She's also the Bert G. Kerstetter 66 University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton, where she was the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs from 2002 to 2009. She has also authored or edited 9 books, including The Chessboard and the Web and Unfinished Business. Everyone, let us all welcome Jennifer Pahlka and Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Standing room only.
Oh my goodness. Half the people here are my family, though.
Not true. Not true. So, good evening, everyone. This is quite wonderful to see a crowd like this, and so I definitely don't have to talk you up. It's our job to talk up the book. But we're delighted to see you, and we're going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes and then open it up to all of you. So, Jen.
Hello.
Hi. So we were talking before. I've been deeply immersed in what I call public interest technology since 2013 because coming out of the State Department, I was very struck by the technologists I knew and their kind of how can we fix this approach, much more so than kind of more traditional bureaucracy. And I thought, this is something people who study policy and politics should know. That was 2013. Mm-hmm. You founded Code for America in 2009. You were way ahead of most of the the U.S. Digital Service, which you helped create, but there were people who did Civ Tech and people who did Gov Tech. But let's start with why. I mean, what made you perceive that early, and it really was early, that we needed an organization like Code for America?
Thanks for coming, Anne-Marie. It's good to talk to you. Really, I was working on this idea of Web 2.0, which I think nobody remembers anymore. It's so long ago. And it got a little bit corporate. But what we were saying at the time was, okay, these principles and values of the participatory web, lightweight technology, user-centered technology. It's great that it's creating this whole world. I mean, back then it was, Twitter or Facebook were new. These are wonderful, but these principles and values have their best application in government. And roundabout then, we had a guy named Barack Obama come along, and the internet helped him get elected. And I think the question for us who were working, with companies on this idea of Web 2.0 at the time was, great, can it help him govern better? And that was got into it through the open data movement and all the interesting things that were happening at the local level. But I will tell you, the Code for America was born at a family reunion in Flagstaff, Arizona, where my friend Valerie's husband, who was the chief of staff for the mayor of Tucson, said, I'm trying to get this application built, and if I do it through my IT department, it's going to take 5 years, and it's going to cost so much money, and it's never going to happen. Why don't you get your Web 2.0 developers to come build this for us? And we kind of all sat around going like, that's actually not a bad idea. And it really began that day. That's sort of where what was going on at the national level came together in my mind with what was going on in local government and how we might, really, bring this, as you said, this different approach to the table. I will say, though, that all of that thinking back then of like, let's just get tech people in, the tech approach will fix everything, that was the beginning of a very long learning journey about, really the limits, I think, of, what it means just to bring tech to government.
So we want to talk about that learning journey, but when you think about government, many of us, the last thing you think about is tech. In fact, when I showed up at the State Department, they handed me a Dell laptop. This is 2009. They handed me a laptop pretty much from 1999. I booted it up once, went back to my laptop, and then would transfer things from, obviously not classified things, but
at
things.
At least they gave you the laptop.
They gave me the laptop. They
I don't
gave
know
me the
if
laptop.
Molly Ruskin is here, but she worked at the VA for 6 months before they gave her a laptop.
But so obviously the Pentagon, we've got folks, the NSA who have great tech, but in general, government is sort of where tech goes to die, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you thought about this, were you thinking that this is a place that particularly needs tech? Were you aware of just how bad the tech was?
I don't think I was thinking big thoughts back then. I've always been sort of a practical person. I mean, Andrew Greenhill needed an answer, and it was interesting, and so we would bring it together. And I think that's actually been an advantage of my journey through this, is that I'm generally trying to solve a pretty practical problem. Yes, tech, government is where tech goes to die, but in the end, government is trying to solve the problems that are most relevant to our daily lives. And when we don't bring whatever it is, whether it's tech or design thinking or simply just a value on implementation to the problems of government, it really matters. And it matters in different ways than when companies use technology.
All right, so let's actually plunge into that journey. So you go into government. So after Code for America, you go into government. You create the U.S. Digital Service.
With some others.
With others. With others. And those others also, have powered the government tech or public interest tech movement. When did you realize it wasn't about the tech?
I think it was a long, slow burn. It wasn't about the tech. It is funny because when I went into the White House in 2013, I didn't think I would be surprised because I'd been working with local governments. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, and yet I still was surprised. In fact, even now when I went to work with California during the pandemic, working with the employment development department on unemployment insurance. I was like, I've worked at the VA. Like, nothing can shock me, and I'm always shocked, and always surprised that it can be even harder than I thought. But I think that there was a moment when I was working in the White House after healthcare.gov had failed. So I came in the summer. Those who were around will remember it was October 1st, right, the beginning of the fiscal year, and the day that healthcare.gov was supposed to launch when the troubles started. And it was a crazy time. My boss, Todd Park, got pulled into fixing it. I was sort of then left without a boss and supposed to to stand up this unit. And I think my thinking was, well, this is terrible, and we need this site to work. But maybe the silver lining is that this project that I've been working on that has been going, in my mind, so slowly, and I look back and go, actually, it's not going that slowly. It just had wrong expectations. But maybe it'll get accelerated, because can't we finally say that you need this competency in the core of government, and that we can't actually deliver on the policy, the promise of these policies without this core competency? And even then, it did not turn around right away. And you and I were talking backstage about how in the very early days of this, people who knew government would say to me, they're never going to let you in. They're never going to let you in. And we just ignored that and kind of charged on in. But I really did feel at that time, when I came back from the government shutdown and expected there to be like the red carpet now for the USDS, and instead was like, oh God, we're still going to slow roll this, that there is a fundamental way of thinking in government that says implementation is not what's important, even when implementation was about to take down the president's signature policy initiative. And it took even more sort of convincing to get us there. And then I talk a little bit in the book about finding I was not the first person to try to do that. And I was just history was sort of repeating itself.
Right. And often I always tell people, look, this is like it was in the old days when your office found a new database and they said, hey, we got a new database and you can dump all your data into it and you can use it. And of course you didn't. You used whatever you had. You might patch a little, you might upgrade a little, but it wasn't the existence of the tech. And that was certainly true. You could go into the Department of Education, you could go into the VA, you could say, here's tech that will work better, and it wouldn't go anywhere. Yeah. So unpack that for us a little bit. What did it take? Because it did. The U.S. Digital Service did get in and did make real differences. But what did it take?
To get people to move?
Yeah.
I think the unfortunate answer to that is over and over again, it takes crisis. Either a crisis like healthcare.gov or what I've seen many of my colleagues do, which is take something that's not a crisis because people can't see it and make it visible and make it a crisis. I mean, it's a crisis for the people who can't access their VA benefits. It's a crisis for people who are, stuck under the cloud of a criminal record that they shouldn't have on their record. It is a crisis for them. And so you've got to figure out how to make it a crisis for the institution. And that's, unfortunately, that has been the answer for a really long time. I do think we're starting to get out of that. But, back in 2013, that's what it was. It was the things that you care about as a policymaker are threatened because we have taken this approach. Or, bad policy and politics, right? There's probably people here who worked at the Veterans Administration during that time, and famously, what this team did was say, nobody in the building at the VA will admit that this application for VA healthcare doesn't load outside the building. Actually, I think Emily's told me since they did actually admit that, but they said, well, it's a browser compatibility issue. It's not our problem. And, outside the building, like nobody could use it because it used a different combination of Adobe Reader and Internet Explorer. But they went out and found a veteran and did screen capture and audio capture of him trying to use it and brought that into the building and made the deputy secretary listen to it and watch it. And then it became real, that it was not just a browser compatibility issue or user error or, well, it's some tech thing that we don't understand. It was like, here is Dominic. He has been trying to apply for healthcare for many years. He's done it dozens of times. It doesn't work. We are failing him. And you know what Sloan Gibson sort of famously said then is like, this is shameful. We need to get this man his healthcare. And that is, I think, a very healthy way of creating the crisis that seems to be the thing that drives us.
I've heard that story. I was
Yeah.
just watching, and of course, something like 67 different programs that you had to access as well.
Yeah.
So from that, we now, whether we do it or not, we talk about moving to user-centered design, right? So that you start with this person that you are trying to help, and you figure out exactly what the problem is from their point of view, and you design some technology. It's often not very complicated, and then you test it. I mean, it's just software design principles. But the government, you say this in the book, the government actually invented user-centered design. So I wanted you to talk about that, because I was very, I mean, as somebody who preaches it, I had no idea that I did know that good enough for government work meant actually good enough for government work. That story we've heard a lot,
Yeah.
meaning better than
Better.
something normal, not something. But where and how and then what happened?
So thanks to Dana Chisnell for educating me about this. I don't know if she's here or not, but in World War II, we had these two pilots who were recognized that there was these new planes that they had given the pilots that were mechanically really fantastic, right? They're specs. If you want to talk about requirements, they flew fast, but they had a terrible user interface. So, the knob to do one thing was right next to in the same color as the knob to do the exact opposite thing. And so you had most of these planes, even though they were sort of like the Ferraris, were just ending up crashing. And for a long time, they called it, as they said to Dominic, the veteran, user error, pilot error. Until finally someone said, this can't be pilot error. Like, we have to reframe this. Like, yes, they're making an error, but because it's so easy to make an error, because these things are designed not for humans. They're not designed to be something you can react to in, you have to have fast reaction times. And so Paul Fitz and Alphonse Japanis are two of the pilots in the Air Force who were credited with sort of writing this all up and figuring out how to like make this one red and that one yellow so you know what you're hitting in an emergency. And that was the beginning of human factors engineering. It really actually originated from the military and the US government, and that's what becomes, over time, human-centered design.
But it got lost.
We lost it. Not everywhere, but we lost it. Yeah, we lost it to a different way of approaching software and other systems, which was just list all the requirements and meet all the requirements.
Yep. So I'm going to ask you about some specifics, and particularly your experience in California, which is quite hair-raising when you write about it. But I want to come back to this, how we lost it and why implementation just is the bottom of the hierarchy. And you talk about a hierarchy, and I ran a school of public and international affairs. We're a policy school, and what we do, we educate people in policy, not politics. Well, then you got to get your hands dirty and really figure out how you get people elected. But of course, we teach politics, but really, sort of the highest art form is diagnosing a political or economic or social or health or education problem and then figuring out the policy that is going to fix it. And then, yes, you absolutely need your political people because they've got to help you get it passed, or if it's got to be a regulation or a law. And then if you get it passed, and it can take a very long time, then it goes into implementation stage. And then, at least traditionally, both think tanks and public policy schools lose interest. I mean, we used to teach public administration, but even that is not the same as policy implementation. What is going, I mean, you started by saying, look, this is a democracy question. If government doesn't work, people don't believe in it. If you go to the DMV and you can't, you don't get your driver's license, if you can't get your benefits, but so why is implementation so low on the totem pole?
Let me just add to your point about democracy. Studies show that when people have bad experiences with government services, especially means-tested benefits, they vote at lower rates. So that is obviously a significant problem that where you can connect the dots directly from government services to the health of our democracy. So, I mean, it's kind of a complicated question because in some sense, I want to talk about the ways in which we started outsourcing everything and how digital got caught up in that outsourcing frenzy. It wasn't really specific to digital. You know, it was sort of the 90s when digital was like, you know, your desktop computer. I mean, we just didn't have it was not as transformational then as it is now. You know, sort of a thesis, I think, about what is inherently governmental and what isn't. But while those are circumstantial, I do think that it does go really deep in our culture. And that's why, you know, people look at the book and they go, it's about government technology. And like, well, technology is a lens through which we're seeing something that is deep in our culture that is creating the bad technology. I had written this chapter about my efforts to get, you know, and mine and Haley Van Dyke and others' efforts to get USDS across the finish line, just to get it launched, and how hard it was and what the resistance felt like. It felt like this isn't an important thing. This is not what we do in the important places of government. And I showed it to my friend Mike Bracken, who had started the government digital service in the UK, and he said, that right there is the difference that they have in the British civil service between the intellectuals and the mechanicals. They just call it out. And she's like, you're trying to do a mechanical thing in the hall of the intellectuals. And I mean, Silicon Valley doesn't think this way. A lot of civil society does not think this way. Things that are built, you know, companies and movements that are built by people doing stuff that start with implementation. But that is a holdover from, you know, a part of our culture that's not going to go away easily. But I think that we're increasingly seeing that people who think those big thoughts and care about the policy get that the implementation isn't like the next step that somebody else handles, but the implementation is where they can learn how to make the policy work. And it's not, you know, a step A, step B, step C, and then it just is out in the world and you never touch it again. It's the implementation comes back and informs the policy, which informs the implementation. And it's just very hard to move from that if you're fundamentally locked into this notion of intellectuals and mechanicals.
And it has huge implications for this town. I mean, as somebody who runs a think tank, right? You don't sit. I mean, I always think the imagery of a think tank is exactly the opposite of what democracy needs. It means a bunch of smart people sitting in a closed environment in a tank, as opposed to this work means getting out there and actually starting with, you know, New America did something in New Jersey with where New Jersey has paid family leave, only 40% take it up. And when we got into it, we discovered one of the problems was the forms, and you've seen plenty of forms. And there were many problems with the forms. One of the problems with the forms is they wouldn't take two-letter last names. So if you were Wu or Lee, you were out of luck because the forms didn't allow for that. So it's really nitty-gritty work that you have to sort of start with. And ultimately, I think you you want to implement before you write the policy, or at least if you were starting something new, you would start with implementation. You would work backwards, and once you had something that worked, then you would pass it.
Well, you start as I think your team at New Practice Lab in particular has been out front with and showing how it's done. You start, implementation means you're starting with the people who are using it. And so implementation is just fundamentally connected to this idea of user-centered design and just putting people at the center of the services.
Right.
You guys you're not the average think tank there, you know.
but again, it doesn't really fit with being a think tank. It does fit, I think, with the way, if all of us, anybody in this town is in part here because we want to solve public problems. We do want to make things better. And the question is, is it, yes, policy has an important role, but to your point, if it doesn't get implemented, it doesn't work.
Can I add
yes,
just another thing
absolutely.
about New America, just because I think that it's your team that has said this the best, and I quote Cecilia Munoz in the book on this. I struggled for a really long time when people would say, well, the problem is that we haven't invested in technology in government. And you're like, there's something wrong with that. Like, starting with the fact that we spend a lot of money on technology in government. What is wrong? And it was Cecilia who said, it's not technology, it's technology people, by which she means people who are going to start with the users, designers, user researchers, not like necessarily people who are just going to type code on a computer. And now I have that language, which is you cannot invest in technology until you invest in the people who can make that technology worthwhile and make that capital investment worthwhile.
And make sure they're at the policy table to begin with, because Todd Park, your boss, always said, he could fix healthcare.gov, but if he'd been there from the beginning, there never would have been a healthcare.gov. If you have technologists sitting around the table at every turn, you learn what tech can do and what it can't do, and that often isn't the issue.
And back to this thing, if we had it and we lost it, I'm just saying this because it's such a DC crowd and some of you will remember this. The first version of healthcare.gov was awesome. Do you remember? It was done by a small shop called Development Seed, I think. And thank you. And it was very, user-centered, lightweight, did really great. And then it kind of went into, then they did that was nice because that was a simple, easy thing. And it's nice that it's pretty. But now the adults are taking over and we're moving into a requirements framework where there's no time for testing. And then we went from something really delightful that got people very excited about the ACA to what actually happened, which was rough.
All right. Well, I want to ask you. So you leave government and you do a lot of things, and then during the pandemic, you get called on to help California distribute unemployment insurance. And I will say, my son, an unemployed actor in LA, depended on that unemployment insurance and managed to get it, although it took a long time. But just talk about what you found when you and others, Marina Nitza, who had been at the VA,
And the New Practice Lab.
And yes, but this is critical, right? You're trying to get benefits to people in this pandemic, in this enormous state.
Yeah, it was really a learning experience for me. Again, feeling like I didn't have that much to learn, and boy, did I. The first thing that occurred to me in that work was that I had people coming from the outside, members of the state legislature saying like, oh, good, now there's some good tech people on it, you can fix the system. And it was like, I don't think you quite understand. Like, it is not a system the way you are thinking of it. It is archaeological layers of technology that have accrued over many years that do not work very well together, or sometimes not at all together. It is not a system at all. And but we had this really profound moment. Actually, Marina had it when she was sitting side by side with these claims processors, trying to figure out where were the leverage points. What could we do to get this backlog of what turned out to be 1.2 million claims cleared? And one of the claims processors, whenever she would ask a question, would say, "I'm not sure. Let me check. I'm the new guy. Let me check on that." And she finally said, "I'm sorry, how long have you worked here?" And he said, "Oh, I've only worked here 17 years. The people who know claims processing have worked here for 25 years or longer." So you think about these archaeological layers of technology and you realize that they only exist because there are even more complex and detailed archaeological layers of policy and process that is accrued from that. And, you know, if you think about it, like, we started unemployment insurance with the 1935 Social Security Act.
Right.
And people think then, okay, so then the policy gets updated. It's not like that. I started to say, like, there's no binder, right? There's just like changes upon changes from, you know, federal and state government, from executive and legislative branches that just pile on. And nobody ever goes back and says, oh, great, let's simplify this, and here's the policy and that governs unemployment insurance in your state. And it's also very difficult because it's different in every state now after all this time. And, you know, the real profound moment for me in that, as somebody who thought she knew what she was doing, was this'll never scale. If you have to have certain number of your claims go through experienced claims processors, and to get more during a pandemic, you would need to go back in time 25 years and start training them then. It's not going to work. And so that was, you know, when I really realized, like, until you simplify the policy, process, and regulation that governs unemployment insurance, I don't mean to be a downer, but we will have another downturn and these systems will break again. And it's not really because of the tech.
Right. Although that is a great example of where the tech points the way to the much bigger problem, because you can't make the tech work because the entire thing is way too complicated. And we were probably ahead of the game when we first started, you know, using those computers, right? If we were starting fresh today, it would be much easier to do. But the tech there is a guide to the larger issues.
Yeah, but I also think that we just continually beat on this notion that if only we got better tech people, we could fix it. And I really truly believe at this point that if we want unemployment insurance to work in the next downturn, we have to start over from the policy, not from the tech.
Yep. Right. So let's talk about tech and policy that works, since we've talked about it.
Good idea. Let's bring it back up.
Let's bring it back up. So, you know, talk about Snap. Talk about example where you really, by bringing in the right people, you could actually deliver much, much better.
So some former Code for America fellows who refused to leave after their fellowship year, God bless them, one of them had been working with the city and county of San Francisco on SNAP in his fellowship year, and they decided that they weren't done because we still had just significant problems with people who needed SNAP benefits being able to access it. And it was pretty obvious to them that one of the problems was that the form to apply online in our county, there are 3 different ones for different counties, but was 212 questions long. It did not work on a mobile phone. Some of the questions were like insulting or frightening. I mean, I wouldn't want to answer that with all these threats of, you know, legal action. And so they just sort of did this crazy hack of making a much, much simpler form. And, you know, showing it to Leo O'Farrell, who was running human services in San Francisco at the time. They sort of famously came in, handed him a mobile phone and said, fill out this form. And he did it. And once he hit submit, the fax machine turned on, and the fax machine sped out an application, a valid application for a SNAP for Leo O'Farrell. You know, the regulations say that once you have, I think, 3 pieces of data, like name, address, and something or other, it's a valid application. The fact that they asked 212 questions is silly, because, like, they're trying to get all the information up front. And that was the beginning of an amazing journey where, you know, it didn't end there. It went through many, many different iterations, and ultimately, you know, became the way that all the counties were having folks enroll in SNAP in California.
And that was in receptivity of the bureaucracy? I mean, what
is a classic example, I think, where Leo was just hugely excited about it from the beginning. Like, he knew this was a problem. He knew that people weren't able to get through the application form. He just never thought, like, oh my God, we could do this and it could just come out on the fax machine. By the way, we didn't continue to send faxes. It was just sort of that was a stunt to show what this product called Get CalFresh could do. But yeah, I mean, eventually, like, some of the counties were excited about it, and other counties were like, please go the hell away and leave us alone. And that's really typical in my experience, is you'll find areas where there's huge enthusiasm because they see a problem and your approach is a solution to that problem. And there's other places where for whatever reason, and I usually want to like put the blame on me or put the blame on us, we've approached them in the wrong way, and it doesn't feel like a solution to their problem. It feels like more problem. And we've got to find our way to get around on those. Just, and really, I think the solution is, if they don't want us, listen to them. Why don't they want us?
All right, I've got one more question, and you all should be planning yours. I will say the best thing government could do to improve its image, or one of the best things, would be to abolish all the fax machines, right?
Yeah.
Whenever you get told that you need to do something by fax, you're like, okay, that's that. I can't do that. I don't know anybody who has a fax machine.
We've tried to do that, and I interviewed a couple people from CMS who worked on that, and it's like impossible to find all the places in the regulation where it still requires
Oh,
it.
I know.
But anyone here from CMS? Yeah, good luck. Keep going. Don't give up.
So I want you to talk about your prescriptions going forward, because if you want government to work, then there's a huge amount here and really wonderful case studies where, yes, government is delivering. I remember Madeleine Albright used to say this about democracy around the world. She would always say democracy has to deliver. Yes, you have to have elections. Yes, you have to have rule of law, but ultimately it has to deliver. And if it doesn't, another system that delivers better will succeed. So it's great if you want government to work and you believe in the benefits, and you want people to get the benefits. But if you think government is the problem, and you don't want to see lots of people getting benefits because that's either expensive or will simply you have a different ideology of government, what then? I mean, is there, I guess I'm asking if there's any hope of any kind of political consensus around not just tech, this isn't tech, the right kind of people, the right kind of design, the right kind of thinking to make government work.
So let me answer that by telling another story from the book. And the reason I'm going to go there is I don't have an answer for folks who have just completely given up on government. But I think we have a huge middle ground where we are losing people that we do not need to lose. And some of those people are, in this particular sort of case study in the book, doctors who take Medicare patients. So after healthcare.gov, you have this agency that's like, we did actually quite well in the end. We enrolled plenty of people in this, and it worked. And we never want to have that problem again. And the next law that they are asked to implement after the ACA is called MACRA, the Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act. I'm sorry, I'm giving somebody post-traumatic stress disorder here. Yeah, and so the situation there was, this was not to the public. We weren't all going to use it. It was the implementation of value-based care. So Medicare needed to get your data about your outcomes, also your billing data, and they were going to change the formulas about how you would get rewarded better for better quality care instead of just for the procedures that you might order, for instance, or the number of times you see a patient. But the doctors were already on the verge of revolt. It was so difficult to file their quality data in the way that they were asking for it now. They hated it, but at least they'd learned how. At least they'd invested in the software to manage it. At least they'd trained their staff. And now this new thing was coming down, and they're like, it's all happening again. We have to retrain everybody. We have to get new software, and it's going to be just as bad or worse. And so their problem wasn't what healthcare.gov was, like keep the site up. It has to be usable. Like the doctors, one of the famous lines from one of the policy team there when they were fighting about a regulation that was sort of too complex was, I get that it's complicated, it has to make sense to a person. And that's really what this team did. Is I think mostly, we have this image that a successful tech project is like, oh, we moved to the cloud, or like, we're using a better programming language. The reason, I'm sure there were many reasons, but to me, the key reason that the quality payment program, which is what came out of MACRA, was such a success was that the team would be confronted by requirements from the policy folks, the regulators, and they would push back. So the first one was the doctors have to choose whether they are a sole practitioner or a group. But guess what? There's 9 different definitions of a group. Well, immediately, it's just like mind-bogglingly irritating and complex, and you don't even want to get to through the first question. Another example was that doctors who took very small number of Medicare patients were exempt per what Congress wrote, but the way the regulators were interpreting that was make all those doctors, small practices, very little resources, go through the whole program for the first year, adopt the new software, train their people, and if they're under the threshold at the end of the year, then we'll exempt them. But you have this tech team going that's crazy. They're just going to leave Medicare. Congress wrote this law to improve the quality of care that Medicare patients get. What is going to happen if we torture the doctors in this way, they are going to leave Medicare and we will have a degradation in quality of care. And in fact, many people were projecting that was going to happen. There was this sort of mass exodus projected. But they fight and they fight and they fight. And fight's not the right word. I think what I would say is instead of directives coming down from the top that just get implemented, they had a dialogue. I'm sure it was sometimes a tense dialogue, but policymakers and regulators were in dialogue with the implementation team saying, that's just not going to work. We've got to go back. We want to have one definition of a group, they got to 2. We've got to, better than 9, we've got to be able to exempt these doctors based on last year's data. And they won enough of those arguments, dialogues, discussions that, when it shipped, the call center was, instead of flooded with angry calls, the doctors were saying, what's wrong? This is too easy. Is this Medicare? Is this CMS? But it's because you have these empowered implementers who can tell you this isn't going to work for the people that you are trying to serve. And the reason I tell that big story in answer to your question is I don't think that any of us can start to advocate for this world that we want to live in until we have a better understanding of what good looks like. And we all need to be telling those stories. And I think for those who are so frustrated about, say, government regulation, that was a government regulation. It just was easy to it was easy to engage with. I don't think people are necessarily pro-regulation or anti-regulation so much as anti-really burdensome, confusing regulation that doesn't make sense to a person. It's not going to get you all the way there, but we have a lot that we can do to convince people that programs like Medicare can be easy to use, can make sense to a person, and then I think the anti-government rhetoric really comes down.
Yep. And reducing friction and transaction costs in our lives. We like it, right?
We
when
love
it
it.
works, we like it.
Shout out to the covidtest.gov team.
Yes. So there is a microphone here, and yes, come and introduce yourself and then ask a question.
Full disclosure. My name is Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician, among other things, and I left medicine in part because of MACRA. And if you want to see why, I wrote an op-ed or a column for MedPage under my Caroline Poplin. Read it. MACRA is not about medicine. Mm-hmm. MACRA is, and I'm a liberal Democrat. I mean, I'm a 20-year veteran of the civil service. I did that because I thought it was important to work for the government. I grew up under the New Deal. Government is good. MACRA is business trying to regulate medicine. And I could go on for another
Your
half
question.
hour. But I wonder if this isn't a generational thing. I mean, kids, when I went to public school, we learned penmanship with pens with nibs and inkwells. Kids these days, I mean, they speak computers. They speak phones. They can't do anything without their phones. So maybe it's different. I mean, medicine is a whole different issue.
I think you might be speaking to just sort of the general lack of tolerance for paperwork. That people do have less. I mean, not just kids, but their parents. Like, we live in a world now where we're constantly distracted, and certain things in our lives have become very, very easy. And so the expectations of the public to have government work with less friction, less paperwork, have really gone up, and that's part of the issue here. Is that part of what you're saying?
Well, it's also important to remember that a lot of those programs like SNAP don't work because the people administering them don't want them to work. The idea of SNAP is to turn people away, to disqualify them for failing to file something every month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next person. There you go.
Hi, Aaron Goldzimmer. So are there ways to change the incentive structure for government employees so it's not just about getting tech people in, but actually kind of scaling and making these new approaches more common and easier within government? And are there ways to institutionalize these processes and these new ways of doing things rather than just relying on, making apparent the crisis, which doesn't seem very satisfying as a fundamental solution?
I mean, my view on that is that there are probably some tweaks to policies that would be helpful, but ultimately I kind of conclude in the book that culture eats policy, and it happens over and over again. So whatever rule you institute, follow all these rules that were designed to create the right outcome. All our civil service rules were designed to have a civil service that was merit-based. It's just unfortunately not how it's working out today. I have a piece in the Niskanen Center this week about sort of examples of culture-eating policy. So, I mean, that leads me to conclude there are things that we need to do that are not rule-setting, though I wouldn't set that aside. I wouldn't say we don't want to do that, that change the culture. So I talk in the book about the accountability trap. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. You are held accountable to outcomes, but you are mostly held accountable for parts of your career to showing that you've been faithful to various processes, and those two don't always match. So when you're asked to choose between, am I going to do something that's a little bit different from the process that's been set and something that I know will actually get the right outcome, what do you choose, and how do we create a culture in which people make that choice? I talk in the book about a woman named Yadira Sanchez, who's back there right now, who made that choice over and over again. And you can talk to her about, I think, what inspired her to do that. But I think one very concrete thing we can do, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is we have a lot of oversight apparatus in our government. Legislative branch, have an executive branch. I guess judicial is sort of all oversight in a certain sense. And we spend all of it talking about failure. If we spent half of that time talking about civil servants who made those right choices and said, this is what good looks like, we want you to do this, even if you're having to interpret the law or regulation a little bit to get to that outcome, that's a good thing. I think that starts to change the incentives, not through new rule setting, but just through changing the culture.
And I'll just add, many of us are engaged in building the field of public interest technology like public interest law. I mean, when I went to law school in the 80s, there wasn't really a field of public interest law. I mean, you could go do legal defense, but through lots and lots of fellowships and internships now, any lawyer knows that's a path. And we've got over 50 universities across the country offering courses and career paths in public interest technologies, so that if you're a technologist, you can take time out and go into the government or go into a civic organization just as you can if you're a lawyer. Next.
Hi, I think this is very interesting. I have two short questions. The first is that a lot of commercial technologies now are actually, sorry,
We can hear.
okay, are actually superior. Commercial technologies are actually better or than a lot of what government is using. For example, see the use of Starlink in Ukraine, the use of commercial drones. How does that change the equation? Secondly, what happens when all the old guys who know Fortran and COBOL die?
Do you have an answer for that one?
I just remember Governor Murphy during the pandemic. He put out a call for COBOL programmers, and everybody was like, "What? What is that?"
I and some other people here helped start an organization called United States Digital Response during the pandemic, and we placed COBOL programmers in states that needed them. I guess my provocative answer to that would be that will force us to zero-base the policy because we won't be able to use the tech anymore. Though it's not just unemployment insurance that has COBOL in it. I also don't think COBOL is the problem. I think that the complexity is the problem. To your first question, I mean, I think that one of the other dysfunctions that we didn't talk about is confusing commodity technology with mission technology. That, we should not be building the things that we can easily buy, but there are things we really do need to build, and we have to have in-house the core competency to run those as living systems. Just because you've bought a piece of technology doesn't mean you can provide the service that goes along with that. So there's more in the book about that. I think I'll keep it short.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hey, good.
So I've been a federal bureaucrat for about a decade.
Thank you.
It's good work, and I enjoy doing it. I became a manager about 3 years ago. And
I think there's a support group forming.
It's rewarding and important work, but I've noticed a lot of issues with sort of federal management and that whole hierarchy. A lack of support from HR, teams that are too big. I had 16 people when I started. I've fought that number down to 12, but I think I've reached a lower limit as far as what my bosses will let me have. It's just like lack of support for performance management and other things like that. And I wonder if, and I'm sorry, I'm only a third of the way through the book, so if you address this, I will get to it. But I wonder if you have thoughts about sort of federal management and if you saw any problems in that realm.
Culture eats policy. I think you can Google it. But it was really inspired by a team that has been working on something with the unfortunate name SMEQA, stands for Subject Matter Expertise Qualifying Assessments, and there's some enthusiasm for SMEQA, it sounds like. Or are you just reacting to the name? No. And I think SMEQA is just a fantastic example of sort of not letting the culture eat the policy or sort of reinventing it. So I don't think we have time to explain all the reasons why these rules that were made to create a healthy civil service are now sort of having the opposite effect. It's just a little bit of a long explanation, but you have a fantastic team of people who've gone back and said, wait a minute, here's what the law actually says. Now there's all these layers that have come down from that of like how it's been interpreted and what processes have been in place to sort of fulfill that law, except that it's the processes now that are sort of flipping the intent, right? But those are not the law. We can change those. And we can create new processes that actually make sure that we are assessing people for their skills before they're hired. Someone correct me, but I think it's 90% of jobs for competitive positions in government rely on currently, maybe it's changed since SMEQA's been starting to spread, rely only on a self-assessment. You get to say, I am fantastic at this, and if you know to say that, and you have the right words in your resume, literally cut and pasted without even pretending that you did anything else, that's how you'll get in. We can change that. We can actually do real resume review. We can actually assess people for their skills, not just based on their knowing to say that they're fantastic at X, Y, and Z. And it's happening. People are actually doing it. And I know for a long time the team at CMS was like, oh, we tried it, and then we tried it again and it didn't work, and it sort of wasn't really catching on, and I hear that it is catching on now. And so if it can catch on at CMS, it can catch on elsewhere. But I think it stands in for something larger, which is how do you go back and say, what does the law actually say? Is this process that has developed over time actually honoring that intent? And if not, there's a bunch of stuff in there that's arbitrary that we can change.
I love it. I really, as you talk, I think of tech as a kind of bureaucratic Geiger counter, right? Where you're trying to make the tech work points you to these underlying problems. It sends you back to the original. Okay, next up.
Hi, thank you so much. I was just wondering how you think we can incentivize, or government can incentivize, young professionals interested in public interest tech to actually pursue the field in such an early career stage, rather than industry, which offers like a lot more financial and frankly like generally like more opportunities to people coming out of undergrad.
And much better snacks.
Yeah.
Do you want to take a stab at that, Anne Marie?
So what we're working on, and when I say we, it's New America and lots of universities, the Ford Foundation, lots of others, is essentially to create the same kind of prestigious fellowships that public interest lawyers have. And in the law firms often sponsor them. And so again, you're going to go into the firm at some point, but getting experience in the Justice Department, getting experience in any number of other departments as a lawyer will advance your career. So that I do think it's culture, right? And at this point in the
What's valued?
Right, at a top law school, to be able to be in the Justice Department's honors program, or to have a Skadden fellowship, or to go to Environmental Defense Fund, that is regarded as a prestigious career path. And those jobs are harder to get than the firm jobs, so you start there. And that we have to basically create those opportunities, and you have to be able to see as an undergrad or as a graduate student in technology, this person I admire followed that path. But it took about 2 decades in law, and we've been doing it for a decade now in public interest tech. We're getting there.
I'll just add, there's a statistic in the book that I don't quite remember, but Stanford did a survey of their undergrads, and it was sort of, what's most important to you in the next step of your career, and then, where do you plan to go, where do you plan to go next? And for the folks that were going into the private sector, like pay and other stuff was like 1, 2, and 3. Mission was 7, number 7 on the list. For the folks who wanted to go into the public sector, mission was 1, number 1. Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to, there's prestige in the larger community, but there's also like, if you go into public sector work, you are part of a community of people for whom mission is the most important thing. I'm not trying to minimize the barriers that exist and the incentives to do something else, but I have just heard so many people end up, saying like, I'm a happier person working for government than my colleagues that work for, I won't name, an industry or whatever, but it could be anything, because my work is really meaningful and I get to work with amazing people. So I want to lift up that incentive as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hard act to follow, but you've got the last question.
Okay. Oh, lucky. I'm Bruna Santos. I direct the Wilson Center Brazil Institute. I think this panel is like a rock star panel, so I'm really happy to be here with both of you. My question is, I think we reached a point where we're living in an unprecedented asymmetry of information between the users, regulators, and creators when it comes to technology, especially when we're talking about AI. And at the same time, there's a group of people right now in Brazil sitting in a tank, probably very closed tank, probably full of lawyers designing the future of AI of the country. So wanted to hear what would be your piece of advice for those people who are designing the regulation for AI in the country.
Oh.
And also here and then I want to hear from both of you, and thank you so much.
So I actually think our best hope for AI is breaking who's designing it and who's around the table figuring out how to apply it. This is not a technology that we can afford to have wreak all the things that it's going to wreak. It's going to do a lot of great stuff too, but it's going to wreak all sorts of havoc. we can see that. And really, there isn't a magic set of rules that is going to fix that. What's going to fix that are having people around every table who say, oh, wait a minute, what about that? What about that unintended consequence for the people I come from or for my neighbor? So it really is going to be opening up that tank, and there are ways to do it. I mean, if you get government funding, there are all sorts of incentives that you can actually connect to having truly diverse teams, which will then, of course, ripple back through the schools. But I think we're better off really pounding on the who, and yes, on what guidelines, et cetera, but it's going to take a long time to get all of that. Love to hear what you have to have the last word.
Well, I don't have much to say about AI regulation. I will say there's going to be a question about how AI gets used inside of government. And I've seen it be used by people working on unemployment insurance communication. So like the email that you get or the letter that you get are often sort of inscrutable. Like you get this email and you don't know what it says. You don't know what you're supposed to do. A wonderful designer named Janice Cho was there rewriting these things. But it takes a long time because you first have to understand what it means. And ChatGPT came out and she just started feeding the letters into ChatGPT with the prompt, rewrite this so I can understand it better. And it just sped up her process. No, she didn't publish that as the letter. She, of course, as she was doing, went back to the policy team and said, is this right? Are we on the right track? You tested it with users, and then you end up making the call to action big and bold as one does. But I think that falls under the banner, I'm going to go back to this term from the team at CMS, it's helping government make sense to a person. And that's a good use of AI. If we allow AI to say, well, it takes 25 years to become a claims processor, it's so complex, that's okay, because now AI will handle it.
No.
We will have government that only makes sense to AIs, and I don't like that future.
All right, hear. So join me in thanking Jen Pahlka.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That was great.
And buy the book, please.